kinds of economic risks facing this project, kind of broadly at the industry level, and then specifically with the Teck Frontier project. In Teck's 2015 project update, section 1.3.7.3 market analysis, they state that the forecasted global demand growth for petroleum products and transportation fuels will provide a robust and economical market for production from the project, and that the North American pipeline and rail distribution systems are expected to expand and will provide sufficient capacity in a timely manner to transport Canadian heavy oil and blended bitumen to the US and offshore markets. And so generally, like the long-term operation of any oil sands project, and of course the frontier mine specifically, are dependent on firstly a scarcity of oil with lower supply costs than the oil sands. Secondly, little serious international action to limit greenhouse gases. And finally, little serious domestic policy or civil society action to curtail oil sands development. So I would argue that all three of these conditions are tenuous. As I'm sure we're all aware, the oil sands are amongst the most expensive category of oil reserves. That's, yeah. The break-even price, the average break-even prices in the oil sands have fallen slightly since 2016, but I'm also wanting to note that a lot of those cost cuts were made through cutting jobs and site maintenance, and I think both of those adaptations, as I said earlier, are largely not in the public interest and makes these projects less safe and providing less prosperity to our communities. And I'd imagine many of you are also aware of when we had the downturn in oil prices in late 2014, we also saw 0.7 million barrels of oil equivalent per day worth of new projects being canceled or deferred past 2020. And I think, yeah, just to highlight, this is not a small 5-year project. We're talking about 41 years here, and looking at the long-term projections for oil, which I'm going to get into that in a second, but just to say that, there's a real risk that this project goes forward, and then at that point is potentially making a very low profit, but because of the high upfront costs of investment, that Teck would continue to operate it, and at that point would be providing little public benefit for huge environmental risks, as which I'll go into and a lot of interveners previous to me already have. And I think just, lastly, to note that innovation to bring down oil sands supply costs or to bring down emissions, as Teck and others have stated, they'll be using these technologies, and kind of assuming that these new technologies are going to come online. That's kind of very similar to the discourse that's existed for the entirety of the history of the oil sands industry, and we've found, there's obviously been some reach those cost cuts and emissions improvements. Moving on to just kind of decarbonization risks and different estimates of fossil fuel demand kind of going into the next 40 years. The IPCC, their AR5 report estimates that to have a 50% chance of avoiding a 2 degrees rise in temperature, and that 2 degrees number is, I think, feels very abstract, but I think a lot of the other interveners have talked about what that actually means in a human cost and as a cost on our ecosystems, and it's truly terrifying. But yeah, to avoid that 2 degrees rise, we cannot emit more than around 1,100 gigatons of carbon dioxide between 2011 and 2050. And so any plausible pathway to this target means we must leave fossil fuel, a large portion of fossil fuel reserves unextracted. And in the case of the oil sands in specific, and this was a reference from Christopher McGlade and Paul Ekins at the University College of London in the journal Nature. They found that just looking at a least cost scenario to limit warming to a 2 degrees Celsius world would mean leaving 85% of oil sands reserves in the ground. And that was done in 2015, so obviously a little out of date now. So Teck has stated that they're in the lowest 25% of emissions intensity for their class, for the oil sands overall. I think there's many interveners who have presented information that questions that statement. But if it is true, it would also, even with that, it would still mean avoiding much of their planned extraction if we were going to stay to a 2 degrees Celsius world. Assuming that's done on a least cost basis, that's 85% of the oil sands, our current oil sands reserves remaining unextracted. And then, yeah, just on that question of global energy forecasts, there's kind of a growing schism in mainstream forecasting. So a growing number of forecasters have released scenarios with a peak demand between 2020 and 2035. And that's not just forecasting demand, that's just forecasting demand, not saying, okay, if you limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, what are the pathways that are possible? It's actually looking at like just the market side of things. So that includes different scenarios from Bloomberg, Shell, City Research, the World Economic Forum, as well as analysts at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo. So as was made clear in cross-examination last week, the market outlook for Teck Frontier largely relied on the IEA's baseline scenario, which assumes 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming, or rather not assumes, but allows for. And so, yeah, just to state that I don't believe that the market analysis put forward has looked at the possibility of an earlier peak in oil demand because of global climate, because of new renewable energy, competing cheaper sources of fossil fuels as well. Yeah, and just to note that the Canadian Association for Petroleum Producers of Canada forecasts also don't include scenarios where global oil demand peaks before 2040. And so just noting that the overall context that we talk about this in is, I think, leads to kind of over-optimistic positions on long-term demand for the oil sands. The last kind of section of general oil sands risks is just around public accountability. So we've seen closely related to decarbonization risks are the public having very real concerns and not having pathways to address the very real climate impacts that are that they're facing, starting to launch very effective public accountability campaigns, not just to do with climate change, but also Indigenous rights violations and regional environmental health impacts. So we've seen over the last few years social movements taking a wide variety of tactics, from lawsuits to civil disobedience to public awareness efforts, and that's created real material risk for all new oil sands developments. In Teck's 2015 project update, section 1.3.7.5 on transportation, they assume that multiple proposed pipelines will be constructed by the time the Frontier Mine comes online. But we've seen with these launched public accountability campaigns, it's less likely that many of these public pipeline projects will be built in the future. If we look at the 7 pipeline projects over with the capacity to transport over 100,000 barrels per day proposed since 2007, only Enbridge's Line 67 and Line 9B have been approved and are in service, and that's about 22% of the increases that were expected by now. We all know this, of course. It's very prominent in the media, but I think it's to have your market analysis and economic outlook, assuming that pipelines will come online when we can look at the ones that are still in the regulatory process right now. And as Mark from Sierra Club BC mentioned earlier, there's the prognosis for a lot of those projects is not looking great. I was going to talk more about project-specific risks, but a lot of my citations came from one of the experts who will be presenting for Stand.Earth, Tom Sanzillo. So I'm not going to go into them here in great detail, but I urge the panel to take these cautions seriously. I did want to just on the economics of Teck specifically, just go into the estimated break-even points for where the project would be profitable. So those estimates from independent analysts have have ranged from $80 to $140 per barrel. So $140 comes from Oil Change International and IEFA, which is the institute that Tom Sanzillo works with. So their estimate came to $140, and that was using the Rystad database. Mark Oberstetter of Wood Mackenzie has stated that oil prices will need to be between US $70 and $80 before the Frontier project will be economically viable. And finally, the Stockholm Environmental Institute also estimated around $80. And so, looking at the range of global energy forecasts that exist, obviously, all models are wrong, but some are useful. But I think just looking at the range of them and that exist kind of in academic and public discourse, and then comparing that to the forecasts that Teck has relied on, there's kind of a dissonance there, where I think there's kind of a section of global energy forecasts that we should be considering seriously as well. I think I'm going to move on at this point to climate. There was a good quote on Tuesday on the Tuesday transcript from Teck on page 60, I think line 11, where they said, "Finally, I do want to say that Teck supports action on all levels to combat climate change, and we advocate strongly for efficient and effective climate action policies." I was heartened to hear this, and I think if they meant it, their project wouldn't be able to go forward. I'm going to talk about kind of some of the emissions impacts, or the emissions estimates for the Teck project specifically, and then go on to kind of putting those into context of the cumulative impacts and how Teck would contribute to them of the oil sands in general. I believe, Teck's estimate has been that greenhouse gas emissions intensity would be about half the oil sands industry average, so just around 40 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per barrel. And then kind of comparing that to some of the independent analysis, the Oil Sands Environmental OSEC has stated in their submission that they believe this estimate is likely underreported by 48%. And so to me, those numbers are strikingly similar, where when OSEC has run the numbers, they've said that because of emissions of sources of greenhouse gases associated with the project, they think the numbers are, underreported by 48%. And so that would mean rather than being half the industry average, this project would be right there with the average. And so just urging the panel to look into those numbers in detail, as well as Environmental Canada, who has also pointed to underreporting on these numbers. I think the assumption that emissions will stay stable over the project lifespan is also really suspect. This assumption runs counter to empirical findings for oil sands projects where emissions increase as the bitumen becomes harder to reach, lower quality, and further from processing facilities. Noting again that the oil sands industry has been around for about 50 years, and they've been trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for a long part of that, and there hasn't been much success. And looking at, again, how international players have left the industry, there's increasing competition from renewable energy and cheaper sources of fossil fuels. I think just, cautioning folks to take promises that there'll be new magical technology to make the oil sands cleaner. I think that's, given the severity of the climate crisis, I think that's, it's a really irresponsible assumption. And then more important, I think there's this overall context that just like discourse around clean coal, an idea of kind of clean oil sands almost isn't relevant when you look at the literature on climate science. We know that to meet our Paris targets, we would need to keep about 80% of fossil fuels in general and 85% of the oil sands specifically to avoid and stay within 2 degrees of warming. And so even if this project does kind of magically make those emissions reductions and become cleaner over time, that won't matter in a context where we're supposed to be, nearing zero emissions shortly after 2050, and making cuts of 50 to 80% by 2050. And then just a little bit wanting to put some of these climate numbers in kind of more global context. I think kind of barring currently unrealistic cuts to other sectors, and this is something other interveners have touched on as well already, Teck is, the project is incompatible with climate change commitments under the Paris Agreement, Canada's 2030 climate targets, and the Alberta Oil Sands Emissions Limit Act. The CAA 2012 requires that an environmental assessment of a designated project take into consideration any cumulative environmental effects, and that includes greenhouse gas emissions associated with the projects. I found looking into the technical guidelines difficult with respect to the methodology for how we're supposed to look at cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. What I found was just that EA practitioners seeking direction on the cumulative effects assessments of greenhouse gases under this act are encouraged to contact the nearest agency regional office. So I might be missing something, but in my mind that signals a lack of clarity on how we're supposed to do this. But I think climate change is a global problem, and so looking at the global impacts of a project makes the most sense to me. Just more on the cap. Teck stated last week on Tuesday that that they believe their project will be within the 100 megaton annual limit on emissions from the oil sands. But there's kind of a range of actors on kind of all sides of this debate that disagree with that. So there's the 2017 report from the Canadian Energy Research Institute that estimated that the cap will be exceeded in less than 10 years by 2026, and that's including projects that are already approved. The Pembina Institute, and I'm sure OSEC presented this information, but found that we're already at 77 megatons, and that once projects under construction or that have received approval are added into the calculation, we're already kind of committed to 131 megatons. That's before adding Frontier Mine to the mix. The Fraser Institute is also agreeing with these other folks' assessments. In 2016, they released a report titled How Alberta's Carbon Emission Cap Will Reduce Oil Sands Growth, basically implying that if it were respected, not all of the projects would, that some projects would not be able to go forward. Yeah, just wanting to reiterate at this point that when we're looking at the emissions impacts for this project, obviously they're just looking at the domestic impacts, so the emissions associated with extracting and any refining or transportation that's done within the country. But climate change is a global problem. It does not care about borders. I really appreciated the question from the panel after Mr. Worthing from Sierra Club BC presented, and wanted to speak to that. So I think often when we talk about considering the life cycle impacts of fossil fuel projects from wheel to well, often people argue we shouldn't consider the combustion emissions when they don't occur in the same country that you're talking about. But I think it's important to kind of do a more thorough economic analysis. So I don't think it's fair to assume that if Canada doesn't produce a barrel of oil, that someone else will automatically produce that. And when people look into this, they find that's not the case either. So I wanted to cite a report called Confronting Carbon Lock-in, Canada's Oil Sands. This is a brief from the Stockholm Environment Institute, published in May 2018 by Peter Eriksson. And within this report, they say, we consider how the oil market would operate if Canada did not produce X amount of barrels. In other words, we consider that if Canada did not produce the oil, some other country might, and that the net or incremental CO2 emissions impact would only be the added consumption that results from Canada's production. And so this is a stance that I believe Teck has stated earlier in these proceedings, that any foregone extraction on Canada's part would just be picked up by some other country. So in this report, they modeled the supply and demand and looked at the supply elasticity for global oil markets for each barrel of oil that was newly extracted, looking at the change in global oil consumption, and found that the supply elasticity was between 0.2 and 0.6 barrels, compared to if Canada did not produce the oil. So in other words, looking at the carbon content or the climate impacts of this, this translates into a net carbon impact of 80 to 240 kilograms of carbon dioxide per extra barrel produced in the oil sands. So looking at Teck's 260,000 barrels per day, that math is fairly easy to do. So I guess to summarize, not to say that if a project didn't go forward, it's not to say that that none of the production would happen in other countries, but to say that the truth is somewhere in between when you look at the economic modeling, and that can be stated on a per barrel basis, which the Stockholm Environment Institute has found to be between 80 and 240 kilograms per barrel. So yeah, I just wanted to reference that study as well. And yeah, I think really wanting to emphasize that the oil sands sector is the fastest growing source of emissions in Canada right now. And looking into the future, there's very little room for, if growth is allowed to happen in line with the projections and the current approvals and the Teck project in specific, we won't be able to meet our targets, even without the assumptions of where we're at in terms of the cap in general right now. Teck would be around 4% of the 100 megaton cap, and I think there's just really compelling. I think there's a lot of compelling reasons why that's not something. It's not a priority in terms of what we should be using our limited carbon budget on. So I wanted to move on just briefly to speaking about different, speaking about Indigenous rights. I think, very aware that 14 nations have signed agreements with Teck. And I just wanted to add to the record some other perspectives. As ACFN Chief Adam stated last week, they had positive negotiations with Teck and reached an agreement that meets their treaty rights. That was said in a release, but he also said in a phone interview with Globe and Mail, we've been fighting the industry for how long? And we've spent over $1 million in court fees with nothing tangible in return. So what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to continue on fighting as a chief while others sit on the fence and say nothing and do nothing? I don't want to do this. I didn't want to make this decision, but I had no choice. I had to make sure my nation was protected and that other people are going to benefit from it in the future. And so I think just needing to consider the context that no oil sands project, except for one proposed by a First Nation, has ever been rejected. And so thinking about that context, just I think it's really important to take consultation seriously and kind of take that broader, more holistic perspective. And I think it's I think just important to. Sorry, I'm getting lost in my notes just a little bit. So last week on. Just trying to find the reference. I believe it was on Tuesday when Joel Asterix from the Keepers of the Athabasca asked Teck about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Their kind of quote about free, prior, and informed consent was that I think it's also very important to recognize that free, prior, and informed consent does not mean veto from any one party that may disagree. And that's obviously one of the great difficulties around free, prior, and informed consent, but it does allow for dissenting parties. I don't find that answer terribly clear because it says, you're not allowed to say no, but there is room for dissent. And so I'm not sure where that leaves us. I did want to quote Ariel Deranger, who was also quoted by Mark Worthing this morning. She's the director of the executive director of Indigenous Climate Action and a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. And she said on free, prior, and informed consent, and this is in a National Observer editorial from April 24th, 2018, the entire declaration, that's UN DRIP, is built on a premise of free, prior, and informed consent, which would require a deep overhaul of current modes of consultation. There cannot be free, prior, and informed. There cannot be free, prior, and informed consent without practices of free, without coercion or intimidation prior to all decisions being made, and informed by providing access to all available information with enough time to evaluate the processes. Canada has put an emphasis on consent and the more watered down version, consultation. The consent process that these energy companies claim to make, this was in reference to Teck and Kinder Morgan, are done through intimidation and coercion, which brings our leaders to make ill-informed decision or wears them down through continued denial of rights over the national interest and jobs. What is happening in my community is a perfect example of this. So yeah, I think just to go off the informed part of free, prior, and informed consent, just to add in the record, this has been a long process. This project has been under consideration for a long time. And so going back into different reporting and comments on the project, it was noted in 2014 in the Northern Journal that the ACFN and Mikisew Cree First Nation have filed numerous concerns about the review process over the past 2 years, citing disorganization and inadequate information on the part of Teck as hindering their ability to effectively participate in the review. According to ACFN, delays in responses from the company left the two First Nations very little time to respond with follow-up questions or comments. Several submissions from ACFN to the Joint Review Panel express further frustration that Teck's application lacks sufficient information on informations to the environment and Aboriginal rights, from traditional land use to groundwater, wildlife, wetlands, and air quality, amongst others. And then just lastly to add, in terms of like having community members be easily able to comment on this project. I was concerned by the, just pulling up the date here, it was the June 6, 2018 notice of hearing, Teck responses to requests to participate. I guess the document number is 123346E, where Teck stated they preferred not holding hearings in Fort Chipewyan, where many of the community's members would, many of the impacted communities' members would be most easily able to access them because of health and safety concerns for their staff. I know that there are parts of the hearings being held in Fort Chipewyan, but I was disappointed to see that there was a reluctance on the part of Teck to go there and speak to a wider range of members of these communities. So again, in this section, I think not making any specific arguments around the question of whether Indigenous rights have been met or not, but wanting to just provide a wider range of opinions, and really, again, urge the panel to reflect on whether there has, truly been free, prior, and informed consent in the cases of all the nations. And again, kind of going back to that, overriding theme of cumulative impacts, just as we have cumulative environmental impacts, I think there's also cumulative social impacts. And so, I think there's, it takes a great deal of money and other forms of resources to challenge oil sands projects. And so in the context of an industry that's been running for 50 years, just wanting to note that it's, I think it would take a great deal of resources to continue to fight these projects on the parts of the communities that are most impacted. In terms of other aspects of my brief, I think there's other interveners who will be doing a good job of commenting on a lot of the other aspects, and so not wanting to be overly repetitive here, but I did want to urge the panel to take very seriously the concerns around the health of the Peace Athabasca River watershed. firstly on the amount of withdrawals from leading into Wood Buffalo National Park and the rest of the watershed, on water quality and contamination from tailings and other discharge into the Peath-Athabasca watershed, on the long-term tailings management plans of Teck. In existing oil sands developments, I think we're all aware that tailing pond infractions are frequent, enforcement is rare, record keeping is dysfunctional, and there is a chronic failure to disclose these incidents to the public. There is no indication from Teck's documentation that their tailings management plan would avoid these incidences, at least from what I've seen. But again, there's obviously interveners who are commenting on this in a lot greater detail than I am. I would also, on behalf of the Council of Canadians, urge the panel to allow interveners to comment on Environment Canada's Wood Buffalo National Park plan that is expected to be ready by the end of the year. As other interveners have already raised, there are significant adverse impacts on the park from existing oil sands development, and this project is even closer. And I think the scale and proximity of the project are incompatible with the short and long-term ecological health of the park. Lastly, I provided 2 references on the social impacts of Teck's fly-in, fly-out program for workers, and just noting that there's a lot of academic and civil society literature that speaks to these risks. So a 2010 analysis in the journal Sustainability found that the nature and extent of mining company interventions in nearby communities constituted a new and problematic relationship for these corporate actors. As a result, mining companies are filling the gaps in local service delivery through a mode of governing that takes the form of patronage rather than partnership. And so I think kind of putting those findings into context, I think kind of a corporation taking on kind of a great amount of control over a community is concerning in any context, but especially in a context where a lot of the communities closest to the project are Indigenous and are, I think, yeah. Sorry, I'm just looking if there was another part of this study I wanted to quote. I did also want to mention a 2016 report by Amnesty International on fly-in, fly-out practices in mining operations in northern BC. And that report found there was severe community impacts, particularly for Indigenous women and girls in those communities. I wanted to thank Mark Worthing for speaking about the corporate record of Teck earlier today, and again, urging the panel to take those comments seriously, in particular with reference to the recent court findings around the Columbia River. And so, yeah, in closing, I would mostly just return to my opening comment that I think the cumulative impacts of the oil sands must be considered in making decisions around the future of this project. When we look at the oil sands as a whole, today there are 176 oil sands projects in Alberta. That's in operation, under construction, approved, in application, or announced. And of those that are built, they have resulted in over 500 square kilometers of forests, rivers, and land, the withdrawal of 111.5 million cubic meters of water annually, the creation of toxic tailings that cover 250 square kilometers, and the creation of 77 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions annually. And again, that's just on the production side, kind of going back to my references of the Stockholm Environment Institute's argument for considering also the impacts of combustion in other countries. When we decide to build a new fossil fuel project, it means that those kind of cumulative emissions, or the cumulative impacts globally, when we look at the oil sands, are much more severe. In general, yeah. So yeah, as other interveners, and I hope myself, have made abundantly clear, there are already enough project approvals slated to come online that oil sands development that make clear that oil sands development is not compatible with the Alberta oil sands cap, our 2030 climate targets, or our commitment to the Paris Agreement. I think these frameworks can sound abstract, but they have very real, urgent human impacts. I think as a panel, you literally have the chance, and I'm really not trying to be trite, you literally have the chance to save lives ahead of you. The impacts of climate change are here already. It's not just a future problem. As we speak today, Taiwan, China, South Korea, and Japan are recovering from Typhoon Trami, and they're expecting another Typhoon Kangri on the way. Typhoons, along with most other kinds of natural disasters, are increasing in severity and in frequency. And in particular, I think the kind of very cruel irony of climate change is that there's a very unfair distribution of climate impacts and responsibility. And so the people with the most responsibility and power over these situations, and I would include most of us in this room on that, we aren't going to be the people who deal with the brunt of these impacts. And the people who will be are largely not in this room. And we have a real ethical responsibility to, make sure we act in true public interest, and not just a narrow definition of profit and minimal job creation. I think kind of, looking at, I think I mentioned earlier just around alternatives, we know there's, like if you look at the 20-something billion dollars that it would take to get this project online, we could create many more jobs in a lot of different industries, in transit or renewable energy, IT, healthcare, education, farming, and I think there's lots of other ways to create the economic benefits that could be associated with this project if there's a high enough long-term oil price, and I just don't see the risk of the project in terms of the climate impacts, the local environmental risks, which are grave and irreversible, and happening in a context where we already have so much development in this region. I just don't see that. I don't see that being in the public interest, and I think myself and other interveners have made that case really clear. So yeah, I think just to close, wanting to appeal to the panel or call on the panel to use, to be bold in their application of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, and stand up for the people who are most vulnerable to climate change. And I mean, looking at the history of these hearings, there haven't been, as I mentioned, there's only been one project rejected, and that was one proposed by a First Nation. Understanding that there's not much precedence for this process to end in projects being rejected. And so I think in absence of that, I think there's also, you do have the chance to, at the very least, impose a lot of conditions to minimize the environmental damage and make the project much harder to build. It's already been delayed it was first proposed in 2009. It's been a long time. I think a little bit of delay in the process could mean it's never built. I don't think that's the best, or that wouldn't be the best outcome for me. I would still really urge you to reject it, but I think just, anything you can do to make the project less likely to go forward for all the people who will be impacted would be, very strongly in the public interest. And I think that's all I'm going to say for today. And thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Ms. Tucker. Mr. Ignasiak, any questions? Staff, any questions?
Staff have one question, Ms. Tucker. You referred to a few reports during your presentation.
Yeah.
Are these publicly available documents?
Yeah, so they're all publicly available. I'm happy to pass them on to someone if that's easier to find. I think most of them were cited in my original submission. I'll check, and if there were any that weren't, I can pass those on to you.
Okay. Was the Stockholm report referred to in your original submission?
I would have to check. Yeah, that's maybe the one that might not have been.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, maybe just to follow up on that, given there was some discussion around it, if we can get an undertaking for you to just check to see whether or not it was referenced in your materials,
Yeah.
and if not, can you provide a link to it or a copy of it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Ms. Tucker, we might as well just try and deal with this now. Is that the report referenced in footnote 35 of your report, your submission?
Yeah, let me just check right now. Yes, it is. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We don't require an undertaking.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. McManus?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Ms. Tucker, you referenced a report or multiple reports, I wasn't quite sure, regarding the social impacts associated with fly-in, fly-out operations, or fly-in, fly-out activity, means of getting employees to mining operations. Could you provide a little bit more detail on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one was in the journal Sustainability. Sorry, I'm just trying to pull it up. And that was, research that was conducted in 2 remote areas in Australia. And this was in my written submission, so you're also able to look there if it's useful. But this is a direct quote from the abstract. It said, "This paper undertakes an analytics of government to ask how mining companies have become leading actors in determining the future of local mine-affected communities." And so, yeah, just finding that companies who were involved in fly-in, fly-out operations in remote areas in Australia, which obviously not trying, like it is a different country, but I think there are there's similar contexts there in terms of the kind of democracy and size of country, and in terms of their Indigenous population. And yeah, I think finding that kind of undue influence where kind of a lack of governance from democratic formal governments, and finding mining companies stepping in terms of local service delivery. And I think, in the context of the region of where the Teck mine is being built, just concerns there around the impact for the communities closest to the project.
Thank you.
I just have one question.
For sure.
It was a comment you made, and I remember reading it in your materials, an observation that there was kind of an increasing GHG intensity trend over the life of projects. I had just a couple of clarification questions.
For sure.
Is that an observation that's specific to oil sands mining projects or other types of projects?
So I wouldn't, the study itself was just looking at oil sands projects. I wouldn't be able to comment on mining projects in general, if that's a common trend. It was a 2016 study from the Pembina Institute that I was referencing there. And so I believe they were just looking at the kind of empirical emissions trends over the lifespan of different projects.
Okay, and so that reference is provided in your report?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, those are our questions. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks. I don't believe there's any other business we can do this afternoon. That was who was scheduled to appear. So we will adjourn for the day and resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.